Hello there, and welcome to the Archive in Between, where I read stories collected from across the dimensions. Take a subscription so you can find me again if you decide to leave. Today's story is called Beyond the Mountain by Eat My Username on Reddit. Prologue. I was 12 when I had first met Elthwyn, in the in-between dreamscape that bridged our worlds. They had been hurt badly, and I had been there to help them. In my nightly sleep, I would find the Fae lying beneath the boughs of the twisted and gnarled trees of their homeland. Each night, I would awake beside them, and they would request my help. I would hurry to fulfill their wishes as quickly as possible. Sometimes, in that dreamscape, I would bring them water from a nearby creek, or a strange windfall fruit from off the forest floor. At other times, they would request more worldly intervention. They would ask me to travel to a certain place in the woods when I woke the next morning, to build a rock cairn or a rock circle, or sometimes to carve a certain symbol into a tree by a certain fork in a certain river. Their requests were polite, but even in those early days I sensed a foreboding malice from the wounded creature, and abided their requests as much out of fear as out of kindness. My father, my only parent, saw this as nothing more than harmless, childish fancy. Make-believe. In this way, through my early teenage years, I came to know the mountain woodlands well that surrounded my childhood home. It is no surprise, then, that, after the passing of my father, I stayed in the area and took up a role with the local government as the wilderness's park ranger. Looking back, I wondered whether it was truly I who had made that choice, and with most of the events that followed, I feared the tendrils that Elthwyn had woven into my life had taken more of my agency than I realized. Regardless, in those early years I nursed Elthwyn, and around my 15th birthday they recovered fully. For a long time after, my dreams were a lonely place, and I began to question if those visions had truly merely been the sign of an overactive youthful mind. It was in my 28th year when that comforting thought was shattered. I was up the mountainside, slogging through a blizzard in search of a missing hiker. The rest of the search party had retired, for fear of the worsening conditions. I had set out alone, confident in my ability to reach Old Man's hut, one of the refuge shelters high up in the mountainside. There was hope that perhaps the missing man had been able to shelter in place there, though after being missing for so long, he was likely well short of food. The slow ascent took hours, and at times the visibility was practically zero. But I had been raised in these mountains, and navigated by memory and the feel of the snow-packed ground under my feet. The pack on my back was laden with food, and I trudged, one foot after another, through the stinging snow. As I ascended over the final ridge before the hut, my heart sank, and I realized I was in trouble. Where the hut had once stood, there was now only sparse timbers jutting from odd angles from the snow. Evidently, an avalanche or landslide had finally destroyed the old building, despite its long years of service. Approaching the ruins of the hut, I found one last further disappointment. A boot protruded from the snow, partially buried under the blizzard's onslaught. I brushed away the snow and found the leg it was connected to. My missing hiker, I realized, and then, bitterly, my companion in death. I lay in the snow beside the corpse, exhausted and shivering. I knew I should stand, dump my pack, dig myself in and build a shelter. To my surprise, I found I could not. I was too drained by the grueling climb, and, despite the cold conditions, I felt overly warm. I wanted nothing so much as to lie down in the cool snow and sleep. I recognized the signs of hypothermia, of course, but being weary, defeated, and faced with the grueling task of survival, I found I did not care any more. I guess the ascent took more out of me than I realized. I closed my eyes and felt the softness of snowflakes falling on my eyelids. When I opened them again, I found myself in the familiar dreamscape. This time it was me laying under the tree, rimmed in ice and snow. Standing before me, Elthwyn snickered, haughty and smiling. "This is no place to die. Do you want my help?" My lips were frozen stiff, and I could not speak, so I nodded. The ethereal creature's smile widened. "Then wake and live. But know now that next time it's your turn for the favor." I awoke, and sunlight was falling on my face. The storm had broken. Part 1. I found the body laying in the glade on the northwest side of the main mountain approach. The trees here were thinned out, but thick grasses grew in the sunlight that sparsity afforded. The gentle mountain breeze made soothing sounds as it passed between the branches, and the long grass swirled in intricate patterns. Not so the grass under the dead man. The body was several days old, but it was undeniable that the man in question had not been killed by accident or misadventure. The man's corpse had been defiled, twisted and tangled in unnatural angles and geometries. To support this aberrant structure, branches and logs had been impaled through joints and limbs. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the man's head had been removed, and in its place the skull of a deer had been sewn, its branching antlers dangling tatters of shedding velvet. The man's original cephalon was now crated in his twisted and mangled hands. I shrugged my pack off my shoulders and settled to survey the scene. In the long grass there was no clear evidence of footsteps, nor any remnant of human tools or influence. The approach up the mountain followed the only navigable route, up a series of ridgelines and ravines. During my ascent, I had seen no evidence of any other hikers. I sighed, and debated descending to call the authorities. It wouldn't be the worst outcome, but it would be impolite. The denizens of the forest here hated outsiders, and they trusted me to maintain their privacy. Instead, I reached into my pack and retrieved a few items. The rock and string, tied as a pendulum, the dust pouch, and the preserved flowers. I placed the flowers before the desecrated body. Then I took a handful of the dust in one hand and held the stone pendulum in the other. I walked a circle, swinging the pendulum while I let the dust drift from my hand. When the end of the dust circle met the beginning, there was a darkening in the glade, as though the sun had passed behind a storm cloud. Beyond the circle's edge, the world had changed. Gone was the temperate mountain forests, sun and mountains. Instead, there were verdant, dark forests surrounding, full of twisting vines and mushrooms. In the distance, there was distinctive chittering laughter. Overhead, the twin suns hung low over the horizon, and the sky glowed a gentle purple. Inside the circle, the only remaining remnants of the mountainside were the grass field and the body. Out of the woods waltzed a figure I knew. They were tall and lithe, vaguely humanoid but with elongated features and an unnatural grace. They were androgynous, and their long, flowing hair coursed over wispy clothes made of no material I could recognize. Like every time I had interacted with them previously, I felt an immense fear and dread at the sight of them. I nodded deeply in a half-bow, and the figure returned the gesture. They came up to the edge of the circle and beheld the disfigured victim. The creature smiled, an indulgent smile, and I felt my stomach churn. My, what have you gotten yourself into this time? Part 2. The figure walked to the edge of the circle in slow, elegant strides. He, or rather they, for the beings in this world abided none of the conventions of a human life, was chuckling under their breath. I was struck with the horrifying impression that I was a lamb staked for slaughter before a mountain lion, waiting only for the blow to fall. Gingerly, they stepped over the dusted circle that lay at the edge of the earthly island. Their name was Elthwyn, and I had met them several times before, though this brought me little comfort. Each interaction with the being brought forth a primal fear and revulsion I could barely contain. Seeing them was like staring into an approaching avalanche, like standing on the horizon of a black hole, a finger's breadth from falling in. Elthwyn had stopped at the desecrated body. They played idly with the shredded velvet tangled on the cervine skull. Seeming to sense my unease, they turned back to face me. "Does our pact still hold?" I nodded, swallowing hard. The violet eyes seemed to stare into my soul. They turned away, tracing the angled geometry of the form before them. "This is not worldly craft. Not craft of your world, anyhow. This is something else. Has the forest changed in temperament?" I stared at the ground and found my voice. "No change to the forest, though some of the animals..." Elthwyn crossed suddenly to me, 2 large strides bringing him to my side. At this proximity, the creature's size was intimidating. I raised my stare from their sternum, bending my neck back to look up at their face. "You were saying," they queried, "about the animals?" I stammered. The animals. There's been an uptick in kills. I thought a sickened bear, perhaps, or some other rogue predator, but it only eats the eyes." The being kneeled and placed a hand on my shoulder. I tried to speak, but only strangled noises came out. Elfwin slowly placed their free hand on the side of my head. I could feel their elongated fingers wrap fully around the back of my skull, and for a brief moment I thought they meant to crush my head to a pulp. Instead, Elfwin smiled and crooned. "So something is killing creatures in the woods. It kills violently, and in large enough numbers that even one of your kind notices. It consumes the eyes of the creatures it kills, and now it started killing humans, and making them into wards." The violet eyes came up to follow me. "Is that about the sum of it?" I nodded, and for a lingering moment locked eyes with the creature. I thought I saw anger or cruelty hidden deep down in those violet eyes, but the smile never wavered. They let their hands fall away from me, and I took a deep breath, just now realizing I had not been breathing. Elfwin stalked away from me, back to the ruined man in the center of the grass circle. The grass was dying now, withering as it failed to acclimate to its new host world. Elfwin leant over the poor, mangled man and snapped off a part of his adorning antlers. Then, using the tip of their fingernail, they removed the velvet and carved several symbols into the bone segment. Elfwin brought the charm to me, and kneeling, placed it in the palm of my hand. "Attach this to your pendulum. It will show you the way to the killer." Then, gracefully, the creature stood, and began to walk back into the woods, as though to say our business was concluded. I called out after them, but they did not turn. I wanted to scream out my denial, that I couldn't do this task, that I wouldn't, that too much was being asked of me. Instead, my throat went into spasm, and I could do naught but squeak. As my ethereal host disappeared back into the forest from which they had emerged, the wind carried a whisper back to me. "Don't forget what you promised me, Ranger." Then the world went black, and I was back on the side of the mountain. The perfect circle of grass beneath me was discolored, blotched and dying. Around it, the green grass of the meadow swirled in the breeze. In the center of that perfect circle, the grass was burned black, and the body was gone. Thanks for stopping by and listening to the story. Take a subscription. It'll lead you back if you get lost, and it'll let you know when I'm ready to read again. I look forward to seeing you then.